Hey everyone, I am wearing my latest me-made cardigan. It has dots, it has invisible hemming, and a lot of other little details and techniques that you don't always find on knit garments. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you the top techniques that I used for making this cardigan, and I think you'll find a lot of these really useful and also pliable to any type of knit garment. So let's take a look on how I made this cardigan.
And the first challenge with this particular cardigan is that I'm using a big bold pattern, and the bigger the repeat, probably the more the challenge will be when it comes to pattern matching. So the first thing you definitely need to consider is that in the fabric store, this is not the time to save on jordis. Instead, you will probably have to add a bit more fabric. And the trick to perfect pattern matching is being very mindful when you're cutting out the fabric. And I have a bunch of tips for that. And my first one is that you should definitely always cut single layer, because as soon as you stop messing with folded fabrics, as many pattern instructions suggest you to do, then it's very easy that the underlayer will slip a little bit and you will end up with a not entirely straight cut pattern, which especially when you're working with these big bold patterns, it will look definitely a bit off. So for instance, in this case, as you can see, the back piece, which is one continuous piece, I have actually mirrored the second piece. So I have actually one big piece for the entire back piece. This makes pattern matching so much easier. And the tip for placement is to use, if there's some type of straight line in your big bold pattern, I would definitely look for that and place the hem along that line, which means you can align it at the same place at the first pattern. And of course, some pieces will not be cut on the fold, they should be cut separately. And in this case, now the front piece is split, so I can't create one big continuous piece with that particular pattern piece. But here is another tip that I think is really good, is that when you cut the first pattern piece and you have this cut out fabric piece, this should then be your guide when you're cutting out the second piece. So you just fold it over, making sure that the same sides are facing, obviously, and then you just check that it's actually aligned all the way around the seam allowance. Just lift the fabric in key places, check that it looks the same, and then you're ready to cut. This is a big game changer if you have struggled with pattern matching in the past. The biggest struggle probably when it comes to pattern matching is when you're inserting the sleeves to the bodice, and there's several reasons for that, because obviously the shaping of the sleeve and the sleeve head can be a little bit different. Often there is some added ease in the sleeve head, which again makes exact pattern matching quite tricky. So I wouldn't obsess about getting that 100% right, but there are definitely some things you can do to improve your chances of good alignment. What I highly recommend here is to use notches. So if there are not notches on the pattern pieces, you should definitely add a few. And I just actually measure first the distance of the sleeve opening on the arm side, and then I place a notch on the bodice piece of the sleeve opening, and then I measure the same distance on the actual sleeve, both on the back and the front, add corresponding notches, and this have just made everything much easier. So just add notches, and again, make sure that all the pattern pieces align when you cut them out. And this cardigan actually has dots, and dots on this, well, that throws in a new type of challenge. I am personally not a big fan of using tracing pen on it. First of all, are usually kind of hard to stick to the fabric, and secondly, if you manage to get some type of tracing that sticks to the fabric, that often means that it will be hard to get rid of once you've sewn the dot. So I have a great method that I highly recommend in general, and in particular when it comes to knits, and here it goes. So what you do is you use on all. You first pierce a hole at the tip of the dot, just inside where the tip is, and then you place two corresponding holes on each side of the seam, again on the inside, because these little tiny holes will be closed once you stitch the dot together. And then you finish off at clipping at the seam allowance where the dot seam ends. Now, this is actually a really, really good method, And in fact, you will be amazed on how accurate this will become just with a little bit of practice. And if you're curious about this method, I definitely recommend that you check out the videos I've done about that. So these will be linked in the description section. Another important thing to know when you're working with knit fabrics is that you definitely need to stabilize the shoulder seam in one way or another, because otherwise the chance is that the shoulder seam will expand when you're stitching the seams together kind of high, and that's a bit of a bummer. So I definitely recommend you use some type of way to stabilize. I personally love using clear elastic. I attach the clear elastic in the presser foot, and sewing from the back piece on the back side, I just overlock and attach the clear elastic at the same time. And why I like clear elastic is because it has very similar stretch properties to most knit fabrics. But you don't need to use clear elastic. You can also use interfacing, some type of fusible tape. You can also use fabric scrap that has less stretch. You can use power net. And there are also lots of other different ways to stabilize the shoulder seam. So you can definitely try out and see which method that works for you. And sometimes you don't even have to add something extra. If you're using a serger, just increasing the differential feed can actually keep the shoulder in check without having to add some clear elastic or other type of stabilizing notions. Now, hemming knits can definitely be a bit stressful, but I have a great tip for you, and that is to use blind hem stitching. This method works really well for any type of knit fabric that has some body and a little bit of stability. For instance, small stable sweater knits, sweatshirt fabrics, double knit, velour, all the kind of fabrics, and quite a lot of them actually that are quite stable. And then you can use the blind hem stitch, because the good thing about the blind hem stitch is, first of all, on the outside you will probably never see any trace of stitching, perhaps just a tiny little dot, and that will be, if you use the same matching thread, it will definitely be 100% invisible or very close to it. And secondly, the blind hem stitch actually has a little bit of stretch built into it. So even if your fabric isn't super firm, you can still do the blind hem stitching. Of course, as always when you're doing blind hem, you definitely need to experiment with the stitch width in particular to make sure that the tip of the triangle actually catches the fabric. And if you have a serger, it's even better actually to use this method, because then you can start by overlocking the edges. I like to use the regular 3-thread wide overlock, and the two reasons for that: first of all, it looks a little bit neater than just the regular blind hem stitch, and secondly, by using the differential feed, you can actually control the fabric and keep it in check, which will prevent it from stretching out when you're then using the blind hem stitch. But again, if you don't have a serger, you can still use this method with very good result. So I hope you enjoyed this little peek behind the scene of my process when I'm making knit garments. Now, of course, I use a little bit of different techniques depending on the garment, but I hope that you find that a lot of the tips that I shared here are really useful, and you can definitely use them for a lot of other things and not just sewing cardigans. And of course, I will also link to separate tutorials that I have where I go more in depth into a lot of the techniques that I showed in today's video. Stitch safe, and I'll see you next time.